It is happening. It's happening. Hi, everybody. We're live.
We are
Actually,
live.
you're going to do the intro? That's what you do.
Yeah, apparently. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mad LiberTEA Party. My name is Paxton, and joining me, with always, is the less colorful Mike today. And, of course, this being a very special interview, we have a lot of very excited guests, I would take it. With us, we have Mr. Maxwell, who's been on the show plenty of times before. And with us as well, we have the, dare I say, the leader of the Armed Bear Caucus with us this day as well. I didn't want to start any conflicts with
Now
the,
there's going to
Mrs.
be
Armed
a
Bear.
fucking war. You have to.
Oh no!
I can hear in the other room.
Roar.
Technically, we're a blended family. She comes from the Wolf clan.
Oh, okay.
So,
Oh, y'all are
And
progressive.
yep.
and
the star of
today
the show.
we and our our star of the show. It's almost like I know what I'm doing and I'm getting to it. We have Mr. Ivan the Troll with us today. Would you like to introduce yourself, Ivan?
Sure. So I'm Ivan. I print guns and design CAD files that you can use to print guns, and sort of involved in that whole sort of geeky, decentralized manufacture of firearms. I've branched off into some other projects that aren't strictly firearms. So I've done very little bits of work in DIY sort of ammo stuff. But I guess the long and short of it is I'm involved in those circles and do those sorts of fun things.
Good stuff.
Heck yeah. And
Awesome.
we usually start off with like oh no, hold on. I did something dumb. No, I didn't. Never mind. Forget I said that.
I
Ignore
like how
it.
you just make the assumption that you did.
Yeah, I just assume I did something dumb. Nothing happened. Ignore what just happened. We usually start out by asking, like, what made you want to do the thing that you're doing now? Like, were you always kind of like into this kind of stuff, or was it like a slow process? What happened?
I mean, I've always sort of had this interest in guns, being from the Midwest, and in as especially coastal liberals would call it, like a gun family, like we're ignorant rednecks from the Midwest. Like I'd always been around them, and in fact, I remember the first time I ever shot a gun. I was in first grade, and it was my father's Auto 5 because he took us sporting clays shooting, and when you're that young, really you just pull traps and he shoots. But I decided I wanted to shoot, and so for those unfamiliar, an Auto 5 and 12 gauge will kick the daylights out of a first grader. So that was an interesting first experience. But after that, I warmed back up to shooting and did a bunch of 22s, and that sort of fostered my interest in guns. I didn't really get involved in, also, this Midwestern dumb people, as we would be generally described, were like DIY sort of stuff with your cars. So maintaining your cars and at-home carpentry stuff. So I'd always sort of had this access to doing things with my hands. So sort of that level of interest. So it was in high school the first time that I got to see and use a 3D printer, and I thought that was awesome. I took a CAD class in high school and found that I had sort of a natural talent for CAD, but it wasn't until several years later that I would finally get a printer. And I got the printer to print like replacement little plastic bits for cars. So like my newest car is like 30 years old. So lots of little plastic bits on the inside that just, over time with heat and UV exposure have started to crack. So I got the printer so I could replace those parts without having to pay like arms and legs for reproduction parts made on injection molding hardware. So I had the printer for probably about a year before I was like, okay, what if I just wanted to print an AR lower? Because I built an AR from a stripped lower before, and figured, it's really not that hard of a process, trivial really. But I figured, what if I just 3D printed one? I just wanted to see how it went, and it took me, I think, 3 tries, and on my fourth lower, it went together, and that lower ended up lasting 2,000 rounds. And so that was sort of my like, oh my goodness, this is so interesting. So I went on, and I think the next thing I went to print was magazines for an AR-15, and that sort of became my first project that I had to do some sort of like developmental work on, because I based it off of the Defense Distributed's. They released files for a printable AR-15 magazine, but it wasn't documented well as far as what printer you should use and what material, and no real information surrounding it. So I had to modify the file some to make it print nicer on FDM printers and document how exactly you got those to work. And I think the first thing that I ever had released of my own original design then was a jig that you could 3D print, that you could wind a piano wire around and then make magazine springs for AR-15 magazines using that tool as sort of a guide. So that was sort of my introduction to developing these things. And from there, it was never like a moment where I like committed, like, yeah, this is what I want to do with all of my free time. It'll, eat up every waking hour of my day. But it just like a very slow progression into like, I spend more and more time doing this. And I find, there's aspects of this that I enjoy a lot. And of course, there's some unpleasant aspects like endless documentation. So detailing how it is that I did what I did so that other people can replicate what it is that I did. That can get extremely tedious, like lots and lots of writing, but like the fun moments end up becoming more fun. So I don't know, like looking back over 2 years now since I've got something released, it's been like there was never a clear point where it was like, yeah, I've decided this is what I want to do. A very slow procedure.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard this story before, but I think that it's a really good one that you should share again. Would you mind telling us how Deterrence Dispensed came to be?
Sure. So my first AR lower I had printed had been probably 3 or 4 months before the last time that 3D printed guns ended the world and no one was going to survive because they were going to be on every airplane was in 2018, specifically right around mid-July and into early August. And so Defense Distributed, the OGs who printed the first gun and were behind the first time that 3D printed guns ended the world and would be on every airplane in 2013, had their lawsuit with the feds because the feds used, they sort of shoehorned the way that ITAR, which is the legislation that lets them control what can and can't be exported when it comes to arms and munitions. They sort of did twisted the way that ITAR works to try and regulate the files for 3D printed guns that private individuals as part of a private company released to the public domain. So they had been in that lawsuit from 2013 all the way until 2018, and that's when the feds decided that they were going to close up shop. They were going to be done with the lawsuit, and they were going to settle with Defense Distributed. So that settlement happened late June, early July, and it was going to be the result of that settlement was the State Department would write a letter for Defense Distributed that said essentially you have permission to spread these files with unlimited distribution, which means you could post them online, you could mail them to people, email them, send people direct links, do whatever you want. So that letter was to go into effect on August 1st, 2018. So Defense Distributed, 2 weeks out from this point, started a great big media hype, and their leader, Cody Wilson, went on a bunch of podcasts and TV interviews and sort of, drummed up essentially terror from anti-gun, anti-freedom folk about this. So that was sort of in that wave of hype. Twitter had Cody Wilson or 3D printed guns trending for like at least a week straight. So I had never actually had a Twitter account that I used. I just sort of had one where I lurked and then sort of kept up to date with things that I was interested in, which was like video games or car news and some gun stuff, but not a lot. But I started like interacting with like every tweet Cody Wilson made was just someone spewing nonsense that was like not even close to true about 3D printed guns, like they'll just let you get right on an airplane, which isn't really the case. Broadly isn't the case, and in the specific examples of the people who are 3D printing guns is like never the case. So I would engage with these sorts of people and like troll them. So I very quickly nuked that account, or I think it got locked out because I was replying to too many people too quickly because it was a relatively new account. So I ended up making Ivan the Troll. So that was like my first real account. I think specifically the handle was Ivan the Troll 12. So I started essentially like shit posting on all the different tweets and information about 3D printed guns. I was enjoying doing that. And it was then that another individual in the Deterrence Dispensed 3D printed gun space, as we know it today, who goes by Jay Stark, who is a European, he was like getting people together into like a little Discord group about 3D printed guns. So I figured, what the heck, I'll join it just to see what's going on. And so the initial vibe that I got was like, it's sort of just like a Defense Distributed fan club. And I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. And there's, people sort of sharing like links to files and that sorts of things. Like it was nothing new or revolutionary, just like a cool place where people were hanging out and chatting about the goings on. So it was then that like Jay Stark asked like if I had any CAD experience, and I was like, yeah, I'm pretty good at it. I've pretty well familiar with it. And so he just started bombarding me with all of these things that Defense Distributed like 2 days before August 1st had released the CAD files that they were planning on releasing, which spoiler alert, was nothing new. It was all stuff that they had taken from GrabCAD or the public domain because they knew they were going to get sued. So they put out files that were already out there as that helps build their legal argument. So they released nothing new. And then that's sort of like a gotcha whenever they end up getting sued about it is, look, we didn't change anything fundamentally about the information that's out there. So the AR-15 CAD model that they had released was like horribly modeled. It was modeled by somebody who was like very amateur and not interested in getting things accurate, just getting things looking right. So I sort of generally refer to these as like video game models. So like you could put that gun in a video game and it would look perfect because everything's close enough to look right. But whenever you look close, like there's magazines that clip inside of the upper receiver and the firing pin channel is too small for the firing pin, like all sorts of little stuff that, unless you come and look close, isn't accurate. So Jay Stark was really interested in getting this CAD assembly of the AR-15 fixed, or as accurate as possible, so it wouldn't have these glaring errors. So once he had found a bunch of these errors, he went and asked Cody Wilson on Twitter. He tweeted at him and he essentially said, like, why the hell is this file that you've released so broken? Why don't you do something? It needs to be fixed. And Cody Wilson essentially came back with, fix it yourself. So Jay Stark sort of recruited my help, and we worked for a really long time on AR-15 CAD assembly. It must have been like 4 months where I was in school at the time, and working like right after school. I would spend hours and hours on. I had a couple AR-15s at that point. Then I would keep them. I had two of them just stripped all the way down to bare parts, just sitting on a table, so I could measure stuff. And because a lot of the stuff we were reverse engineering, so pulling measurements from existing parts at that time. And so that project sort of went on for a couple months until we eventually had someone send us the technical data package. So that's the 2D machinist prints for every part on an M16A1. And the M16, of course, has huge parts similarity, dimension similarity with the AR-15. So that eventually ended up giving us the boost that we needed, because there were some dimensions that are just really hard to measure with traditional tools. But with the CAD or with the technical data package, we were able to get the AR-15 CAD assembly much, much better than it was before. But deterrence dispense sort of started, if you had to pick a moment when it started to formally exist, it was when Cody Wilson gave Jay Stark that challenge, like, okay, well, fix it yourself. And so we set about to go and fix that ourselves, and eventually got that fixed. And that spawned a little bit of a we got more people involved in that Discord chat, and the Discord chat probably lasted maybe 5 months past that point before we ended up abandoning ship there, because Discord is what it is, and even if it's a private group, Discord's listening. So we had known from the get-go that it wasn't going to be a great place to stay. But sort of that movement, or whatever you want to call deterrence dispense, was born out of that challenge from Cody, sort of like to tell us to fix it ourselves. Maybe we will.
That's kind of nice. I like that.
The same challenge that you pass on relatively frequently now, huh?
Right. So it's like the torch has been passed, maybe again in some symbolic way. Like, and of course, I wouldn't want to say it's a very fair comparison, because Cody asked us to fix a CAD assembly for something that already exists, which is probably a doable task. And a lot of the time, like, I'm asked, well, could you make a 7.62 Tokarev minigun that you could mount on the hood of a Jeep but weighs less than 5 pounds? And I'm like, no, but you can, go right ahead. Like, I'm asked some of the most bizarre things. Like, I'll get people.
When are we going to get 3D printable Glock uppers now? Right,
3D printable Glock slides is probably like the number one thing I get emailed. Like, can you print a Glock slide? And at first, I had in fact, probably still on my old phone, I have like a note that I would copy paste to reply out of, like explaining, like in detail, like 5 paragraphs, why that's not going to work, why it's not a good idea, but I encourage you to try. And he eventually got so tired of you just copy pasting it that it'd be like, try it and let me know.
Now, would that be the Glock 7 slide?
Right, at that point, it's basically just have to make it out of ceramic. We need somebody with like clay modeling skills,
like Die Hard,
claymation,
a kiln,
and a kiln. Kilns are really expensive.
God, yes,
yeah, they can be. Yeah. Oof. That
This
is an
episode,
expensive
Talking
problem.
Kilns with a 3D printed gun designer.
Random hashtag
And
music.
now you guys have a lot of stuff out there. Like, you have Glocks, you have, I believe the MLtP Shield files are out there. And all of these things are being made by the group in the Keybase, correct?
Right. So I had spoke with Jake Hanrahan, who's a British journalist who's sort of interested in niche warfare related stuff. So 3D printed guns are interesting to him because they skirt governmental regulations to varying degrees around the world. So, I had described it when I was talking with him as like a renaissance of 3D printed guns. And so that clicked for both of us. Like, after I said it, I sort of realized like that's actually kind of an apt term. So prior to Deterrence Suspense, prior to whatever boom happened in 2018, you saw a lot of 3D printable AR-15 lowers that would be good for around 1,000 rounds. So they were decently well designed. There was files for the VZ61 Scorpion, so not like the Black Ops 2 Scorpion, the Black Ops 1 Scorpion. That's usually the way to get young people to tell them apart. Young people like myself. I'm not trying to say that I'm like old or something, but
confusing the Scorpion Evo with the original VZ61.
Lots of people confuse the two of them for some reason, and I guess it's CZ's fault because they gave the same name to guns that are like not even one's a machine pistol and one's a submachine gun, so it's not like one was an evolution of the other. It's not even close. But there was VZ61 receivers that people were printing, but there wasn't a ton of other stuff. So there was 3 big guns that sort of spawned from the Liberator. So there was the Liberator itself, and then Songbird and Washbear were 2 mostly printed. Mostly printed as in it had like a firing pin that was steel, like a roof. You'd use a roofing nail as a firing pin, and like rubber bands as a hammer spring. But for the most part, most of the gun was printed. And so that's Songbird and Washbear, which are both better designs than the Liberator, but made in the same spirit as the Liberator in that regard. As well as you had Durwood's AP9 Shooty Gluty series. So that was mostly 3D printed with like a do-it-yourself steel bolt, and then used a Glock barrel. So you had some development there, but there wasn't a ton of variety. And so after 2018, I think it was I want to say it was late 2018. Freeman Don't Ask, who's another developer in the Deterrence Dispense sphere, had approached me and said, like, look, I've got 3D printed Glock frames. And so I'd seen the 3D printed Glock frames that had been out there before, except they were all like only rated for like 22. And so, not to knock 22 long rifle Glock uppers, but that's not like really a Glock upper because it's a blowback 22 and not like a tilting barrel actual Glock action. So he was like, no, this is actually a 9mm, and sent me a video, and the video was grainy, and I was so in disbelief of because I would never have suspected this would be possible without I didn't expect the frame to hold up very well, and he just shows me a video of him just mag dumping this, and it's grainy enough. I'm not even sure if it's 22 or 9mm casings that it's kicking out. So I was like, okay, that's sort of interesting. I was like, do you have the CAD files? And he says, well, no, because the computer I had done the CAD work on crashed. And I was like, oh yeah, great, sure. But no, it turns out like he actually did have this all the way thought through and done and designed. And so the 3D printable Glock 17 frame that everyone knows today was like his brainchild that he had done once. And then after seeing the sort of fun we were having with 3D printing AR lowers and AR mags and sort of like the attention that was being drummed up around it, he wanted to go through and redo his work. So I worked with him to sort of redevelop his spec for the rails and the frame to get everything close enough that it would work reliably. And that was like our first release. And the amount of traction that we got from that was absolutely insane. So whenever I posted my first video of it shooting on Reddit, the thread was just overwhelmed with people telling me like, oh, it's not going to last. It's going to break. You'll blow your hands off. There's no way that this works for more than like 10 rounds. And just people who were completely naysaying and way short selling the abilities of a 3D printed Glock frame. And
people still do that a lot.
Right. People do still do that, but you saw the people who were saying that on Reddit get like way upvoted because everyone agreed with them, right? Everyone clicked the agree button on Reddit. So it wasn't until we finally got like the release version of the gun and released the trailer, and it got maybe 3,000 or 4,000 upvotes on Reddit, the post itself, but it finally got to the point that people were like, well, this is stupid. You're just going to blow your hands off. Go and get like a proper Glock frame, or better yet, get a 1911. And
You'll
these people
put your eye out.
These people were downvoted to oblivion on these Reddit threads. And so like in just a couple months, people saw my progress posts, and they saw like people went from like, maybe a printed Glock frame isn't safe, to like, look, I've got videos of myself just mag dumping a printed Glock frame and it does fine. And here's the best part: I printed it in PLA, which is like the crappiest, least suitable plastic to be printing long life useful parts out of. So it sort of blew a lot of people's minds and sort of reset the bar for what someone's expectations of 3D printing like this could be. So a bunch of other projects ended up happening in this time. A lot of them were championed by Freeman Don't Ask, who sort of had like this backlog. So like he had been doing these projects for a while, but was able, with our encouragement and with seeing how much attention they got, to sort of bring them to fruition. So the Ghetto Blaster, the 3D printed Tech 9 AB10 frame that he did, brought tons of people's attention in, because anybody familiar with that gun knows that they have a history of being terribly unreliable, like they jam every other shot. But that's usually due to the fact that the magazines don't fit well in the guns, and the magazines, like one magazine to the next, isn't actually made identically. So the magazines themselves are kind of crappy. So Freeman Don't Ask had redesigned the Tech 9 receiver so that it could use Glock mags, which feed much more reliably, much better system there, as well as the Tech 9s that are out there. Prior to this point, the Tech 9s that were out there were multiple kits, so everything but the receiver that you could buy, because the receiver on people's guns would crack, because Intratech was making them out of like the crappiest polymers that they could get their hands on back in the 80s and 90s. And by today, those receivers had worn out, and no one was making replacement receivers. So the guns that then broke got sold as kits of parts because the receivers broke, so you could no longer use it. But to the point where there were so many of these breaking, as well as so many of these being caught in like police raids and police buyback schemes, that, and just to preface, and I guess I should have prefaced this whole story with it, like when I say parts kit, I mean that in the US, because only one part of a gun is regulated as a firearm, all the other parts are just spare parts. So if you have a parts kit, that's like all of the parts except for the federally regulated firearm. So if you print the federally regulated firearm, the rest of the parts kit can just be ordered straight to your door, and then you can build out the part you printed as a working gun. So the Tech 9 parts kits that were out there, there were like probably a good 20, 30 of them for auction on Gunbroker at any given point in time. And they had been there for years because no one had a use for these parts. And people were buying them for like $50 a piece. So these parts kits cost next to nothing. After the printable Tech 9 frame was released, you immediately all of the kits dried up. And the first time we noticed like the fact that people were really interested in buying these, we noticed that there was one that went for like $300. A parts kit sold for $300, so it went up 600% in price just because of the fact that you could 3D print a receiver for it. So we've seen some go as high as like $450 now, but they generally hang out around the $300 range even still. And so it's sort of interesting, like in this way, you also see like more people have embraced this idea of, okay, yeah, you can 3D print usable parts, usable receivers, in some cases that are more reliable than the original factory options, the original factory configuration, just because it uses Glock mags in this case, but it's better nonetheless. And so that was sort of the moment that I realized that there are significant things happening. So like the public perception of this sort of thing is changing. And so, development just went further and further from there. So you saw Glock 19 frames come out, different versions of Glock 19 frames, different versions of the Glock 17 frame. There's a Glock 43 frame, a Glock 26 frame. Freeman Don't Ask went back and modified them all to have their P80 spec. So the Polymer 80 Glock frames that you can buy as 80% have their rails that are proprietary to them. So Freeman Don't Ask went back and redesigned the frame so they could take Polymer 80 rails. So if you wanted to have like a funky, like whole hand, knuckle trigger guard on a Polymer 80 railed gun, you could then 3D print your frame for that and then drop in your Polymer 80 rails and be good to go. So there was like an explosion of people's interest there, and that really got a lot of people interested in buying Ender 3 printers. And from there, just like even more projects like the Plastikov, the 3D printable AK receiver. More AR-15 designs came out to the point where they were getting like really, really good. and even easier to put together than the previous ones that had existed. I'm sure I'm forgetting tons, but I mean, there's just loads and loads of printable frames and receivers that you can end up going after. Probably the most popular right now is the Mac Daddy is one of them. So that's a Mac 11 9mm upper receiver that you can buy as a parts kit that you can put on a 3D printed lower receiver that can take an AR-15 fire control group and Glock mags. And that's been wildly popular because it's a fairly interesting, fairly affordable pistol caliber carbine that you can make yourself at home and avoid all of the background checks and serial numbers and stuff. So you get to do your cool freedoming. But it's like a really cool firearm that's unique in the regard that there's nothing like that you can buy on the commercial market, and it offers you some features that the commercial market doesn't. So you can't really get your AR-15 super nice light trigger pull trigger to go into a factory, whatever your commercial options for a Mac 11 gun, whatever Mac 11 that's being sold commercially. You can't necessarily get your nice fancy AR-15 trigger into it. But with 3D printing, for like $4, you can print yourself a receiver that enables that, and then you can have mag commonality with your Glock handgun. So there's like all sorts of cool stuff that's happening in that regard.
So and all of the links to all these things can be found in the description of this video. Shannon R. Watts has been kind enough to allow us to use her name in a domain. Now, you guys got permission for that, right? Totally. Sure. Yeah. You got. She. It seems like something that would be right up her alley, right? So if you go down to the link in our description, you can find all these files on there, and you can make them yourself. But on that note, barriers to entry. What do people have to do to get started in this, Ivan?
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask.
Right. So luckily for her, the hobbyist interested in getting started, it's like easier now than it ever has been, which is something we should expect with technology. But it's kind of got to the point that like if you can buy furniture at IKEA and you don't have to call your dad or some sort of father figure to help you put it together, then you're totally able to print guns at home. So 2-3 years ago, I don't think that was necessarily the case. It was a little bit more difficult just from a standpoint of it was hard to find good instructions on how to get everything set up and get going. But Control Pew, who's another one of the developers in the 3D printed deterrence dispensed gun world, has put together an extremely comprehensive guide specifically for getting your printer set up. So we sort of standardize on the Creality Ender 3, which is a little made in China. It costs $200 is the MSRP or thereabouts, but I've seen them go on sale for as cheap as $150. So it ranges between $150 and $200. Right when Rona hit in the US, they went up as high as like $230 just because nothing was getting shipped in from China. But they're back at normal pricing now. So right around $200, you can get yourself a printer. And following the guide that Control Pew put together, which is on his website. So if you Google Control Pew the guide, then you'll land there at the first result will give you this extremely comprehensive guide he's put together that covers everything from, I have no experience with a printer and I don't know what to do. So it walks you through, you buy a printer, your printer gets here, how do you put your printer together? How do you adjust the settings on your printer so that you can get it to print something that isn't a complete disaster? How do you get once you've got a print finished? How do you go about getting things cleaned up on it, and all the way to now that you've got yourself printing, if you're interested in making your own files or modifying existing files, where do you go to learn how to do that? So it's got everything sort of under one roof in that regard.
Nice.
So the barriers to entry have really come down to, can you follow simple instructions that in many cases, if they're not like video instructions, they're like IKEA style instructions with pictures that sort of tell you what to do. So it's become much, much easier for the amateur to get involved in. So it's especially given the how cheap printers are now. So the Creality Ender 3 is relatively new to the 3D printer scene. Prior to its existence, if you wanted the sort of quality that the Ender 3 could afford you were looking at like $600 to $800 for a Prusa. So the fact that it's come down in price so significantly in just like a year or two is significant. And especially when you look back at like 2013, when the printed gun first came into like the public conscience, is something that is a thing. You'd be spending $20,000 for a printer, and so the fact that $20 grand for a printer that has about equal quality to the Ender 3 is capable of. In that, in 7, 8, 9 years, we've come so far that a $20 grand printer is outperformed by a $200 printer, at least on the, at least for the fact that it costs 100 times less. So it's easier now than ever to get involved. And the Creality Ender 3 is so loved by the 3D printing community broadly. So just outside of the printed gun world, that pretty much any problem that you end up having with it, there's already somebody who's had that problem and has troubleshooting guides or a video on YouTube that sort of walk you through how to fix it. So I would say, yeah, barriers to entry. I mean, I guess just like finding the gumption to doing it is probably going to be the hardest part for most people.
And we went from 3D printers costing as much as a nice CNC mill to being the cost of a desk you would put it on.
Right.
So, and the filament isn't very expensive either. The roll of PLA Plus is what, $35 on Amazon?
Yeah, 25 for PLA Plus.
25. Ooh.
It's the media that you print with is extremely cheap. Even if you want to print in the nice stuff is glass filled Zytel. So I'm a sucker for printing stuff that I really want to last a long time. And it's a glass filled nylon proprietary to DuPont. That is, DuPont being like the original maker of nylon, if you will, the first mass producer of nylon. They've sort of got nylons figured out, like it's what they do. But the glass filled Zytel is a wonderful filament that prints very easy, very low warp, and it costs $100 a kilogram. But you can end up getting like 4 AR lowers out of a kilogram, so that ends up being like $25 an AR lower if you elect to print an AR lower in glass filled Zytel. I generally stick to doing pistol frames in the glass filled Zytel, and so it ends up being maybe $10. You can print yourself a Glock frame or a Browning high power frame or whatever it is that you're interested in that regard, for relatively cheap, especially when you consider like what a new Browning high power frame costs commercially is like $500 or $600 because you can only get them made in steel, of course. But you stand to save a ton of money by doing this when it comes to certain firearm parts.
And Armbear, you had a couple of questions you wanted to ask?
Yeah, you fed him the good one, which was, the barrier to entry has dropped precipitously even in the last 2 to 5 years, like he was saying. I mean, you just not to go on too far of a tangent, but I mean, home gun manufacturing has gone from, 50 years ago, you had to have a machine shop and a lot of skill. And now you don't have to have any of those things. You can drop to a couple $100 and some materials and a little bit of gumption and knowledge and turn yourself out of, like you said, an AR lower. But I think a lot of people are probably going to ask next, if not soon after, is the FBI going to knock on my door if I print an AR lower and build a gun? And you can flesh this out, but I would say generally no. Everything, home production of firearms is legal for personal use, as I understand it still. So if you wanted to maybe, just elaborate a little on that.
Democratic People's Republic of New Jersey.
Right,
course.
in the United States, assuming you're not in New Jersey or someplace equally horrible. So as far as gun laws.
The quick rundown there is California and New Jersey, and I think Rhode Island are the exceptions in the U.S., but everywhere else, so long as you're legally able to own it, you're legally able to make it. So essentially the way that works is the ATF defines manufacturing a firearm. So if you manufacture a firearm, you need a federal firearms license. But they define manufacture as you make a firearm with intent to transfer it. And they define transfer it as sell it, give it away, or dispose of it. So like essentially they're trying to cover like I just left it on a park bench and my buddy picked it up and left $300 and then I picked up $300. So you're not allowed to like get rid of it in that regard. So essentially, so long as you make the gun for yourself and intend to use it yourself, it's perfectly fine to make your own gun because that's legally not manufacturing. So that's true on the federal level. There are a couple states that place additional barriers to doing it. So California requires you, in order to make a gun, to ask the California Department of Justice if you may exercise your rights. And then I think you have to pay them a fee, and then they will say, yes, but you have to put this serial number on the gun that you make for yourself. And so as you can imagine, everyone who would want to make a gun to do ill is like lining up to go ahead and get their serial number before they go and shoot someone, because California is the arbiter of intelligent laws that work really well. Mm-hmm. And then New Jersey has a deal that's even longer lasting that essentially outright bans anyone from making a gun. So it's essentially New Jersey has defined manufacture a gun as a new gun has been created. Doesn't matter who made it or what for. So the only way you can legally manufacture a gun in New Jersey is if you have an FFL. And even then they make it difficult for FFLs to do it. And then in Rhode Island just recently passed a ban that I believe, it's been a while since I've read it, but I believe it amounts to a similar deal to California's. And if it's not similar to California's, then it's just an outright, you cannot make your own gun. But again, we all understand that it doesn't actually stop you from making a gun, because they're not going to stand between you and your printer. It just makes it so if you're caught with a gun that you made, you're slapped with an additional charge. So the laws in place against it right now are like totally ineffective at actually stopping it. But I guess that's the nature of most laws, right? But I get the point here is that the laws aimed at stopping this sort of thing have been totally ineffective at like actually coming up with a solution that would stop you from doing it before you've actually done it, which is generally speaking what laws in anti-gun circles try to set out to do. But that's generally the lay of things. There are other places that it is legal to 3D print guns, though. So like outside of the United States, in Canada, if you're legally able to own it, you're legally able to make it. So if you have your PAL, which is essentially the prohibited items license in Canada, if you have, and essentially you need one of those to own firearms. If you've got one of those, and so that license enables you to own semi-automatic magazine-fed firearms as long as the magazine capacity is less than some arbitrary number, and the barrel's over a certain length. So long as it meets Canada's requirements for what legal firearms you can own, you can make such a firearm. So I've had several Canadians send me pictures of guns that they've 3D printed that they've done legally. So even outside of the U.S., there's some of these instances. There was a guy in one of the Nordic countries. I want to say Norway, but that could be wrong. But he had 3D printed a Glock frame, and because he was able to own machine guns, because in some European countries owning machine guns is easier than it is here in the U.S. He had got a machine gun upper, so a Glock 18 slide for his printed Glock frame, and so he had himself a 3D printed Glock 18. So in other places, it is perfectly legal to print guns. You just have to sort of fall within their existing schemes for firearms ownerships, which usually involves licenses and usually involves registration. So I believe that guy in Norway had registered his 3D printed Glock as being owned by him.
Right.
And even in places where it's totally illegal to do so, like most of Western Europe and Australia, we've been seeing a lot pop up there too, right?
Right,
even
which is certainly an interesting phenomenon. So of course, like since firearms have been a thing, and since firearms prohibition have been a thing, like people have made guns to skirt gun laws. Like that's not even close to a new thing. But it's been interesting seeing such a young technology as 3D printing sort of have like an inane grasp on. And I guess I'm going to venture to say most of them are younger than your traditional interested in freedom crowd, and so you sort of have these like millennials and Zoomers 3D printing guns in places where it isn't legal to print guns. So we've seen lots of the FGC9. We've seen several examples printed in Europe. We're into the double digits of examples that I've seen printed in Europe. I've seen 2 or 3 printed in Australia, and I've seen at least one has been printed in New Zealand. So all sorts of places have sort of seen FGC9s pop up. There's one that's been made in China even. So like there's FGC9s that are popping up in these places, and despite being like a relatively young design and despite being like a relatively young technology, so like the people who were making guns illegally before this probably didn't have 3D printers. So it's interesting to see people who like probably otherwise wouldn't have made a gun have now made themselves a gun despite the fact that it's illegal, because even in places with like very strict firearms prohibitions, they're still able to make themselves a gun. And in large part, that's thanks to the convenience that a 3D printer can afford the budding home gunsmith.
But Ivan, what about ammo?
So that was a meme, I guess, that was born out of when we released the Glock frame. So when we released the 3D printable Glock frame, which is like the first release that was actually worth something, that was worth paying attention to, because the AR-15 magazine spring was interesting, but it's a little bit more of an oddity because even in California with their high capacity magazine bans, they don't ban the spring. It's the magazine body that they want to see you not have. So it was more of like a proof of concept than anything. So right after we were to release the Glock frame, on Twitter, there was like an overwhelming wave of people who like started replying as it started getting late here in the U.S. So you can reasonably assume that they're the European crowd who need to find something to be scared of because they're European. And so, they just started flooding in with comments of like, okay, but that doesn't matter because you're not printing the slide in the barrel. And eventually you just get tired of explaining to them like, yes, this doesn't matter to you and your miserable continent. This matters to people in the United States because in the United States, the frame is the only part that it makes sense to print because everything else you can you can buy easier than a trip to Walmart because it'll just be shipped straight to your home. So yeah. I eventually got tired of explaining that to them and just started ignoring them. But like there was tons and tons of Europeans who came out to say like, but what about barrels? But what about specifically? But what about barrels is what people were most interested in because of course 3D printing barrels. While there are some notable examples of printed barrels that do work. For the most part, and especially for something like a Glock, you wouldn't just be able to print a barrel. So it eventually got to the point that as Jay Stark was starting on the FGC9 project, he realized that it was going to need a do-it-yourself solution for a barrel, and so he was looking at like the Ludi submachine gun, which was like yesteryear's do-it-yourself entirely at home 9mm auto-loading firearm. Use just like a standard tube, like a plumbing tube that would be smooth bore and just slightly bigger in diameter than a bullet, and so it would like spit a bullet out much like a musket spits out a musket ball. So it's not terribly accurate, and the bullet will be tumbling as soon as it leaves the barrel. But like inside of 15 yards, it's reasonably accurate. Just anything past then, you're like hitting your bullet will hit somewhere in a 3-foot diameter circle at like 20 yards. So it's not very accurate. So that's because, generally speaking, making rifled barrels, making accurate barrels is very difficult. So Jay Stark had asked if I could see if I could come up with a way to make a barrel. Because, of course, me being American, it's much easier for me to get ammo and have room to test because it would take a ton of testing to get a do-it-yourselfer solution for a barrel together. So I looked into a couple different options, and it was eventually Jeff Rod, who's another developer in the 3D printed gun space, who was, I was looking into button rifling and seeing what could be done there. And he was like, dude, don't waste your time with button rifling. Look into electrochemical machining. So electrochemical machining, the short version of it is whenever you apply an electric current to a piece of metal across, some potential difference. So there's got to be, some voltage pushing current through a piece of metal, and you have an electrolyte, so an electrically conductive fluid flowing past that metal. Some of the metal ions in the barrel will because and I'm going to forget if it's ionic or covalent because it's been forever since I had chemistry, but it's whichever one, wherever they share electrons, you can convince these metal ions in the barrel to stop wanting to stick to the barrel and form a more favorable bond with the electrolyte in this fluid that you're pumping past it. So you're on on an atomic level, you're pulling metal ions away from the barrel and having them form more favorable bonds with the fluid that you're pumping past it. And so metal gets machined away from the barrel on the atomic level, but the more you ramp up current, the faster and faster you can get this to happen. So the short version, the concept there understood. Like the easiest example of how you could use electrochemical machining is if you take a steel tube and you take a metal rod down the middle of that steel tube and you apply current from the steel rod going out to the steel barrel that this rod is inside of, and then you pump salt water past it. The metal from the barrel will be machined away following the shape of this metal rod. So if the metal rod is circular, it will machine the inside diameter of this metal tube out bigger and bigger and bigger as long as you continue to pump fluid and as long as you continue to provide current. So, in the specific example of making barrels, you can take this hydraulic tube, you can take the metal rod down the middle of it, and you can machine this metal tube out to the perfect inside diameter for a 9mm bullet to go down. Then you can take a 3D printed tool that has copper wire that's wrapped in a spiral shape, much like the shape that rifling would need to take, and then throw that tool inside the barrel and pump fluid past those twisted copper wires. And once you can apply current, then it will machine into that barrel those twisted grooves, following the shape of that wire, because that's, current is flowing from the wire to the barrel. And as it's doing that, it's machining away the barrel in the shape of that wire, because current can only flow where it's exposed. And so where the wire can see the barrel, you can machine away this spiral shape. And then finally, you can go and chamber this thing much the same way that you did, setting the bore of it. So you just have a rod that's in the chamber end of this barrel that's insulated, so it can only cut on the chamber. And then you'll cut your chamber out to size until you can, drop a round in it. And the round, seats all the way, that you're done. And so just like this, you've turned a standard piece of hydraulic tubing, so an unregulated pipe everywhere in the world. You've turned that pipe into a machine, completely built 9mm parabellum barrel that is extremely accurate. So it's much more accurate than like an unrifled thing like the Ludi had used. So the first generation of ECM barrels that I had tested, I got like 2.5-inch groups, which is about what a factory Glock 17 barrel will do. Of course, we understand the caveat there is a Glock 17 barrel moves as the gun cycles, so there's some inherent inaccuracy in a Glock barrel from the action that's not to be blamed on the barrel. So it's at least on par with a Glock in terms of, like, if you're shooting a Glock versus something with a fixed ECM cut barrel of the Generation 1 pattern, they're equal in terms of accuracy. You have factory level accuracy in that regard. In my newest experiments with the electrochemically machined barrels, I'm getting like 1.5-inch groups when I'm firing like from a bench press. So I don't even have the barrel strapped down. I have the barrel in an FGC9, and I have that FGC9 rested on bags, and I'm shooting like 1.5-inch groups with this, which is better than factory level accuracy. In fact, it's like really good. And these groups are at 25 yards. I don't know if I mentioned. Right. So that's quite good. So that was like the answer to, but what about barrels, was like, well, here you go. So I proved it, I tested it, and then I fully documented it, and then I gave it out to the masses. And so now we've seen tons and tons of people who've made barrels, and lots of people with suggestions for improvements. And I'm sort of working those improvements into my revisit to that project. So the version 2 that I was talking about. But like almost like clockwork, as soon as we had released the do-it-yourselfer barrels, there was people flooding in like, oh, okay, well, that doesn't matter because what about ammo? But what about ammo? So everyone was flooding in like saying, well, clearly it must be impossible to get ammunition in Europe because Europe controls ammunition. So much the same way that Europe controls barrels, but you can still make barrels, there's like tons of loopholes that you can abuse in, especially in Western Europe, that allow you to still make ammo. So, but what about ammo was like a very brief, it probably took me about 2 works of like research and development, and then like 4 or 5 weeks, maybe a month or 2 for documentation. So it was very documentation heavy, but in Europe and even in the United States, there's these tools that carpenters or home builders will use that are known as powder actuated tools. So powder actuated hammers will take a little, it looks like a 22 long rifle cartridge, but it's just crimped at the end because there's no bullet, so it's just holding in powder. And these tools will use a little gunpowder charge to drive a nail, and it'll shoot a nail hard and fast enough that it'll sink it into concrete. So it's useful if you're doing concrete work. So they're known as like powder actuated hammers, the ones that'll shoot nails into concrete. But there's different sort of powder actuated tools. There's powder actuated chisels and stuff like this. So in Europe, the little cartridges that you use for those powder actuated tools are generally not regulated. So the company themselves that makes them will only sell them to you if you have a business, but that's probably more for logistics and distributions reasons. But there's tons and tons of like third-party retailers on like eBay and the European equivalents of Craigslist and eBay that sell like thousands of these cartridges at a time. They're like overrun from a contracting project. So the guys got done building a house and they had tons of these left, and they don't want to have to move them around, so they're just going to sell them where they built the house locally. So
you can find, like, if you just go to a construction site, and I've done this before, I have like probably 100 of those blanks lying around, because after the people at the construction sites are halfway through a strip, if they finish their job, they'll just throw them aside.
They just dump them.
Still left in there.
And so in Europe, you can buy these charges completely unregulated. So normally people's question is like, well, how would I get gunpowder, or how would I get primers in Europe? Like, those being generally the two regulated components in Europe is primers because they're explosive, and gunpowder because they're an accelerant that can be used to make bombs and or ammunition. Meanwhile, the bullets in cartridge cases and fired primers in Europe are, with the exception of like one or two countries, are completely unregulated. So you can buy them as like decorative ammunition is usually what they're called or sold as. And for people who want to like collect bullet cartridges. So in the US you can collect cartridges the same way in Europe you can collect deactivated cartridges. So usually it's a fired case with a spent primer still in it, and then they just press a new bullet in on top of it to make it look like it's loaded, but it's it's unloaded in that regard. And if not, like bullets, projectiles themselves can be bought in Europe because they're not regulated, because European regulation centers around the gunpowder and the primers. So what about ammo ended up becoming, at least the first installment in it, was specifically exploiting this sort of loophole that exists in their laws that revolves around the nail gun blanks. So I had documented what nail gun blanks do you need to buy? How do you pinch open the crimp on them? How much gunpowder do you dump out of them? And as well as I documented like what sort of gunpowder is this actually? So it turns out it's like good, non-corrosive, fast burning pistol powder that they actually load these with. Like it's not like some crappy, unclean burning gunk. It's like actual good pistol powder. So I documented how much you would need to use to reload 9mm ammo. I had Jay Stark sort of help me document like what are the terms that you would need to search for in various European countries in order to find deactivated cases, deactivated ammo, so the other components. And also I'd found a video of like some super hillbilly dude here in the US that reloaded primers for some long extinct centerfire cartridge that used a strange primer size that's no longer used. So his only option to get new primers was to reload old ones. So he had documented how you could get primers out of old cases. You could take the anvil out of them. You could beat the dent back out of the primer cup. You could refill the primer with priming compound. And then you would have yourself a remanufactured primer, a rearmed primer is how I decided to call them. So following his method, it turns out that you can do exactly this with fired 9mm Luger, 9mm Parabellum primers. And so I documented as part of this, but what about ammo? Like you can just reload the fired primers because no one's going to regulate a fired primer because it can't do anything. But you can reuse it to reload it. Much like the ammo components that aren't regulated with this gunpowder out of the nail gun cartridges, you can reload them. So that was like sort of a quick demonstration for, and I'll joke and be mean to Europeans, even though I commiserate with their situation. Not being able to legally own guns would suck big time. But I'll make fun of their lack of gumption for like, I don't even live in your regulatory scheme, and I'm exploiting the loopholes in your regulatory scheme. Like, you guys got to get this together. And so it has been kind of cool because I've had several Europeans send me pictures of like, the ammunition that they reloaded following this loophole. Like one guy sent me a picture of 500 rounds that he had loaded, and he had said like, it took him about 600 nail gun blanks and he reloaded 500 rounds. And he said it ended up costing him about 50 cents a round. I mean, this was right around the time Corona was hitting. So in the US, 9mm was not costing 50 cents a round in the US at that time. So it was like, wow, that's kind of expensive. But considering you can't buy it normally, that's not bad. So now in the US, 50 cents a round isn't too bad for 9mm. People are paying 50 cents or more a round for 9mm. So
we're going to have to start using that.
I sure hope not. It's a tedious process, but like, it's sort of got promise in that regard. And so it was cool to see like, there are then Europeans already taking advantage of this. And I mean, I'm sure what that will eventually lead to is Europe will start cracking down on the sale of, fired cases and primers and bullets themselves, projectiles. But so long as that loophole is open, like there's your easy way to get pistol powder and primer compound completely unregulated. Like no one asks a question if you want to buy like, in fact, like I've seen people send me listings for like 10,000 Hilti cartridges for sale in Germany. So if you want like 10,000, 10,000 of these cartridges will probably reload you about 7,000 rounds of 9mm. So there's 7,000 rounds of 9mm worth of powder and priming compound. I mean, there's tons and tons of it, and it's being sold relatively cheap. The Hilti blanks, the nail gun blanks, are actually quite affordable. It's the decorative cases and primers and bullets that in Europe are fairly expensive. So like, this option existed for a long time. It's not like I invented anything new for this. All I did was like documentation work. But sometimes that is what it takes, is just to let people know of the things that are possible.
Now, I don't know how many people here are familiar with Cathode, but he's a awesome person who's involved in all of this stuff. And what has your involvement been in his thing? Because I know that he's working on some very interesting stuff in the ammo sphere for countries that don't have access to that to those blanks, where even those are regulated, like in China.
Right. So Cathode has been working on a project. Well, a couple projects really. So the first thing that he approached me with was he was working on do-it-yourself electroplating for lead cast bullets, and I thought that was super cool. And I was like, well, if you can put together some cohesive documentation on that, that would be a great start for. But what about Ammo Volume 2? Because Volume 1 being the exploiting the nail gun loophole. And he was like, okay, yeah, I'll work on that. And so then, it was probably less than a week later, he came back and said, look, I'm going to work on 3D printing a positive for a mold that you pour silicone in to get a negative of a mold that you can then take the plastic printed part out and then pour lead into it. And then your negative silicone mold now becomes your bullet mold. So like 3D printing the forms to make silicone bullet molds. And then it's like, okay, that's super cool. Let's see how that works. And so he'd done some 9mm standard ball rounds, as well as like hollow point 9mm rounds like this. And to my shock, the silicone mold holds up quite well to having boiling lead poured into it. So he's reused the same mold like eight or nine times without having any degradation of the mold itself, and has been able to cast himself 9mm bullets using this tool, which is super cool. So, that sort of cuts having to buy a bullet mold out of the equation, because you can just 3D print yourself something and then silicone cast a negative and then pour hot lead into your silicone. So, he was then working on do-it-yourself casted bullets without the need for a bullet mold. And I was like, well, that's super cool. Definitely document that, because that would be great to include in What About Ammo Volume 2. And then he came back with, he was going to work on documenting powder coating bullets. So if you don't want to use electroplating for cast lead bullets, you could still powder coat them. And I was like, well, that'd be perfect. And so that was at that point that I was like, I reached out to him and was like, hey, you're doing a ton of work here. And at this point, you've basically written, but what about Ammo Volume 2? And we can just call that How to Make Bullets, in regulated places, because you've covered all of the relevant topics and made great use of 3D printing to make it so none of the stuff that you're buying ends up being terribly expensive. So you can make yourself a copper electroplating setup for pennies on the dollar compared to what a commercial one costs, because you can 3D print most of the complex parts for it. So that was awesome to see. So at this point, there's a couple final renditions and a couple final checks on the work that he's done, but he's basically done But What About Ammo Volume 2, and it's just sort of on me and one other guy who was validating his results to get that published at this point. So he'd done amazing work there. So he'd already earned my admiration, because he's really putting in work, and he just came out of nowhere and started doing this, which is just great. And his current project is perhaps even more interesting than all of that. So I guess we'll go down a little bit of a rabbit hole here. So
we do rabbit holes. That's our thing.
Sweet.
So go ahead.
The rabbit hole costs extra.
So in the world of do-it-yourself ammunition, generally speaking, it's fairly difficult to make your own smokeless powder. So when it comes to gunpowder, there's black powder and smokeless powder. Black powder has I want to say it's 50% of the going back to chemistry, whenever you have your ignition reaction, so your combustion reaction, I should say, 50% of the products from whenever black powder burns, 50% of what's created when you burn it presents itself as a solid. So half of it becomes a gas, half of it stays a solid. What that means is whenever you fire a round that's charged with black powder, there's a ton of gunk that's left behind. In comparison with smokeless powder, I think it's 5% or less of your reactants are solid. Everything else turns into a gas. So black powder is in this regard not very good to use in auto-loading firearms because it'll fill them up with gunk very quickly. So smokeless powder is much preferred in that regard, as well as the fact that black powder is technically an explosive and not a propellant, because that goes like way off into physics. But black powder isn't safe to do some sort of neat high pressure stuff with because it tends to want to explode in very fine grains of black. Very fine grain black powder tends to be more of a bomb than it does a good stable propellant. So smokeless powder is sort of this gold standard of, like, if you buy ammunition at the store, it will have smokeless powder in it. There are different kinds of smokeless powder, so there's all sorts of different, like, small variations, but like the big family tree of smokeless powder is their single base and double base. Single base smokeless powder only uses nitrous cellulose, I want to say. So
Yes,
nitrous cellulose is also known as gun cotton. It's known by like a ton of different names. Like every country that ended up adopting smokeless powder, which spoiler alert, is pretty much every country. In fact, by now it is every country for their military adopted smokeless powder, and everybody wanted to call it a different name. Whereas double base powder uses nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin, so it's got a little bit more oomph to it. So generally speaking, your high pressure and rifle caliber stuff will end up using a double base powder, and your pistol stuff will end up using a single base powder. So the short version then of how single base powders end up being made is you need to have nitric acid, and nitric acid in many countries ends up being regulated because it's a precursor to pretty much everything that explodes. So like pick an explosive compound, nitric acid was a precursor component to it. So like fertilizer has nitric acid in it, and that's what makes it so explosive. So like ANFO, ammonium nitrate fuel oil, the nitrates there come from this acid. So that ends up being regulated. So when you come to make smokeless powder, whenever you come to make nitrocellulose, you end up mixing that acid with sulfuric acid, and sulfuric acid acts as a catalyst. So it just makes it so you need less of your predecessor acid in order to make gun cotton or make your nitrocellulose. So you end up needing this nitric acid and this sulfuric acid as a catalyst, and then you can mix cotton in essentially anything with cellulose. You can just put raw cellulose in, but cotton is, that's where gun cotton got its name, is you can use the cellulose from cotton. So with this nitric acid, you can then create nitrocellulose. So nitric acid ends up being regulated most places. Of course, here in the U.S., it doesn't make a huge difference because you can just like go and buy gunpowder. A lot of the time, some states you can just buy gunpowder without an ID even. So in countries that control gunpowder, it would be nice if you could find a way to get nitric acid, because that only leaves you one or two steps away from having single base smokeless powder. So there's a machine, a device, a process that's known as the Birkeland-Eyde machine and or Birkeland-Eyde process. And the way that this setup works is you use the air around us, the air that we breathe is like 70% nitrogen. So you can use the nitrogen in the air to make nitric acid. The problem is it's fairly inefficient, generally speaking, to do this. But using a very specialized machine, which is what this Birkeland-Eyde machine is, you can use essentially you use an electric current to make a plasma between two electrodes, and that plasma will energize the nitrogen in the air and greatly increase the rates that you make nitric acid at. And so then by flowing air through this machine and then pumping that air back into water, you can use the plasma to make nitric acid, and then the airflow dumps it back into water, and so that water will slowly become more and more acidic as nitric acid starts to build up into it. So what our fellow cathode had done was take this machine, build one of these machines as cheap as possible, using a lot of 3D printed parts and mason jars to sort of save on the equipment. So when this is done industrially, it's using like millions of dollars worth of equipment. So like tons and tons and tons of stuff that you wouldn't be able to fit in your home, let alone afford. So it's like generally going to be a factory floor bigger than your house is the machines that are going to be doing this. But he's found a way to like downscale it to the, like it can sit on your kitchen table. And his results so far have been excellent. So last I had seen, he ran it for 2 days, And he got it so like the little beaker of water that he was pumping the acid into got to the point that it was like had a pH of 1, and then because nitric acid boils at a higher temperature than water, you can just put your mixture on the stove and then boil all the water off and be left with pure nitric acid. And I think he got like 0.5 milliliter out of 2 days, but that's pure nitric acid. So you don't necessarily need pure nitric acid to make nitrocellulose, but it does end up helping. But the proof of concept is already there. With this very small do-it-yourself in your home machine, he's made himself a measurable quantity in relatively little time of this controlled substance.
With a mason jar, some spark plugs, and the 3D printer. Right,
and so it's amazing the fact that the setup that he has put together is, it's relatively cheap and not terribly complex, but he's done the legwork of putting all this together and is now working on documenting it, perfecting it, making it so the power supply that runs this plasma, of course, gets very hot, and so he's burnt a couple out. But he's working on like cooling systems for it, so you can extend the life of that component. But long story short, he's making huge progress at like knocking down this control of the precursor component to make smokeless powder with, which people may not realize the significance of right away. But I think it's an easy sell on the significance of this. Once people sort of become familiar with how easy. So whenever he finally will have gone from the air, so literally the air you and I breathe, to gunpowder, I'm sure more people can be convinced, like, oh, holy shit, their control of gunpowder is now so in danger that they would have to ban the air we breathe to keep you from making it. And that's like if you close your eyes and think about that before you go to sleep, you'll have a hard time going to sleep, simply because the ramifications of that are absolutely insane. That he would give you the capability to make this controlled substance in your own home out of the air. Like, it's not like it's some loophole, like you can just like pop on down to the hardware store and buy some nail gun blanks. He's using air.
Do irreversible acts.
You actually answered a question that I was going to ask later, was where are we on smokeless powder? I was going to say, if you wanted to go old school, you could have probably manufactured like the old primers, like potassium perchlorate stuff, in a higher end meth lab pretty easy. But this and actually making components for smokeless is kind of huge. He's not kidding.
Yeah, because that opens up the door for not only Western Europe and North America. You can make that no matter where you are.
Point to a place on Earth that has air, and you can now make gunpowder.
Well, in the final,
literally everywhere.
I would also say the final piece of the puzzle would be like printable casings or something similar like that out of either I don't want to say display too much ignorance here, but that like extruded metal printing is probably the next thing to come in, right?
I wouldn't even think that you would need metal printing for cases. So I've got a couple ideas.
Or just a plastic, a higher tensile strength or whatever.
I've got a couple ideas. So since we can make our own barrels and we can make our own bolts, and so we're not tied down by the proprietary existence of cartridges that were meant for metal. I've got some harebrained sketches that'll eventually be able to play out better, like printed cases that are like dummy thick, that can be printed in like something like PLA or some more regular plastic that will then be strong enough to work, reliably, because we can print ourselves barrels and we can print ourselves bolts that can work with these sorts of things. So I don't think cases will end up being a huge problem. There's like a little side team on Deterrence Dispense that's working on like taking a brass rod. It's like brass piping, very thin wall brass piping, like you would use in where I'm familiar with it is my father used to like homebrew beer. And so they had used this little very, very thin brass tubing in the little rig that they had made for some process in brewing beer. Didn't really pay a lot of attention to it. But that's where I became familiar with this very thin wall brass tubing. But there's a team of guys that are working on using that to make cases out of. So there's tons and tons of options when it comes to making cases.
You don't have to use brass. I mean, Blazer, the cheaper aluminum stuff works fine. It's just you can't reload it.
Steel or polymer. So there are tons and tons of options in that regard. So I don't think cases will end up slowing slowing things down too much. I think it's this, once this work on gunpowder is figured out, it'll be huge. And I do want to mention, so there's another developer in this printed gun deterrence dispense world who goes by Incarbonite. And he had, so we had a guy in China, so that had figured out, he had managed to get some nitric acid in China, and he had used that nitric acid to make smokeless powder from it, documented this whole process. Right around the time that things got really bad in Hong Kong, we lost contact with him for several months, so we were like, oh shit, this isn't good. But he eventually did get back to us and sent us a little bit of documentation in like bad English, and there was like a little bit of confusion in it, but he sent this documentation to us, and so we compiled that and got that to Incarbonite to test. And so Incarbonite went through and essentially repeated his results. So he started with nitric acid. So cathode has gone from air to nitric acid, and then using commercial nitric acid, Incarbonite had gone from that plus cotton to make, that plus cellulose to make nitrocellulose at home, and then make its own single base powder. And through Austin, who's the lead engineer, developer, founder of Atlas Arms, those are the guys who are working on the 9mm super high velocity armor penetrating round. Yeah, the Dagny Dagger. So he's the guy who's working on that. He's got pressure testing equipment for that. So Incarbonite had got some of this, this homemade powder to Austin, and Austin had done pressure testing data on it, and we had found that it's fairly consistent. So I think the standard deviation was within what you would consider acceptable for factory ammunition, so it wasn't terribly inconsistent. And this was with powder that he had made from commercial nitric acid. Given the fact that cathode has got down to pure, even concentrated nitric acid, we can now see that they still have that last step to go, where you use the nitric acid that you yourself made to make this gunpowder with, and then test it for consistency. But essentially, this whole process has been explored from not having nitric acid to having nitric acid, all the way down to making your own single base gunpowder, all the way down to pressure testing it, and it tests okay, and it burns clean like you expect it to. So that barrier has come so very close to being crossed, and then from there it's just a matter of extensive documentation. So you have to make sure that everyone will be clear and follow the same steps, and that one of the things I do when I'm doing my documentation is I want to be as sloppy as I can while I go through and do this process, so I can try and catch like what sort of things will being sloppy lead to you doing. So that way in the documentation, you can sort of write like make sure you don't do this, because if you're sloppy, you'll do this. So you try, right. You try and catch these errors in advance, so that avoids you having like the frequently asked question of, and of course you'll still end up being asked these questions, but you'll at least stop most people from having to ask these questions. So that's like probably the biggest time barrier on this homemade smokeless powder, is that double base will be a whole different story, because of course you have to make nitroglycerin. I don't think there's any getting around making nitroglycerin for that, and making nitroglycerin is like really dangerous when it comes when compared to making nitrocellulose. With nitrocellulose, you sort of risk a fire or like a loud flash, because in its raw form, it's like flash paper, and if you snap with flash paper in your hands, it'll burn. You can't catch fire that easily because it's very flammable.
Nitroglycerin will blow you the fuck up.
Right. Meanwhile, nitroglycerin is something like, if back whenever like smokeless powder was first coming onto the scene, there was some guys messing around with nitroglycerin. So they were making smokeless powder with nitroglycerin as their single base, and so there was no nitrocellulose involved. And they blew up like a whole lab and killed a whole bunch of people. And then because they had a lab that was full of this stuff, and they knew it was explosive and knew it needed to be handled with care. But and I don't remember how this story goes now, so I don't remember if it was like they had a beaker or little vial that they had it in that was cracked, but when they shook it, the glass cracked, and then that blew them all up. So it's like extremely explosive, to the point of like being dropped means it can explode. So nitroglycerin is not something that somebody should mess around with, and generally the only way to keep it safe is to keep it very cold, because it's not as impact sensitive whenever it's cold. But when made with double base powder, it becomes much less explosive, to the point where I don't believe it's contact explosive at all whenever it's made into double base powder. But nitroglycerin is something that it's going to be, I don't want to say prohibitive, but very difficult to do it in a perfectly safe way. So double base powder may be longer off in that regard, but single base powder, I think, as I've explained, it's there. I mean, it's something that needs only maybe another month before it's proved out entirely as a proof of concept, and then from there, just has to be documented and improved on where it can, and then like everything, released to the public, and then have the public give their feedback and their improvements.
So to summarize some of this for everybody watching at home who's trying to get their continuing education credits or what have you, the technical problems are being solved. The cultural problems are probably the next biggest thing. I would say the legal issues, there aren't any legal issues really to some of this. Maybe, when you're talking about the powder, depending on locality. But I just think it's really fascinating that we're in a time, like, literally you could have a garage size operation that was A to Z. We're just like you said, if the single base smokeless powder is pretty much there, we're very close to, like I said, once the casings are kind of solved.
Like
in the United States, it's not a big deal, but I'm thinking like a Hong Kong apartment,
right? And
something like that.
It's the apartment scale stuff that I think has that really highlights the biggest promise of what 3D printing does offer for the do-it-yourself home gunsmith. Like, right. Obviously, you've been able to make a gun forever, but like people will come at you with this argument, like against, so that their argument against 3D printed guns is why they're not important, interesting, or significant is because, in their words, like, you can just buy yourself a mill and a lathe, and then mill and lathes have existed since like the 1900s, and you can make yourself lots and lots of guns with those. So if we ignore the fact that it takes like 10 plus years skill and experience on those machines to make anything useful with them, if we ignore the fact that they cost like tens of thousands of dollars, if not more, if you buy new, even if you buy used, you're still looking at thousands of dollars. Even if we ignore the fact that you need triple phase power for most of these machines, like like the weird 3-4 plug for washing and drying machines, generally that's what these machines use because they need quite a bit of power to run. So even if we ignore that fact, you still end up at the wall that is, you're not going to get a Bridgeport mill in your apartment, especially not if you're on like the 5th floor, because you'd have to knock out a window and then put it in through the window, because you're not getting it up a stairwell. You're not going to fit it in an elevator because these machines are huge. Like, the types of machines that you would need to make useful and interesting gun parts aren't going to fit in your 5th story apartment. They're probably not going to fit in your 1st story apartment, and you probably don't have triple phase power anyway. And so like, there's a lot of restrictions that the traditional way of doing it puts in the way of your common day, your common person from having a chance of doing this. And 3D printing like comes in and smashes all of these. Like, it's $200. It uses a standard wall plug. It takes up like 2 square feet on your desktop. Of course, if you get to the point like me, like you're printing and prints like sprawl out all over, like you're going to have a mess. But you have the capability to put this in a 2 square foot area, and the mess will just be a mess. But it fits in like on a tabletop. And what with Cathode's doing, your little do-it-yourself home gunpowder lab won't take up much more space than that. So it's not going to take up the size of a room. It's not going to take up even the size of like a king-size bed. It'll be taking up like the floor space of a table, or like an end table, really, and you can sit there and let it run and then make nitric acid on your end table. You can sit there and watch Netflix while you make nitric acid. So it's very, very interesting to see that the 3D printer has offered you for $200. Like, it doesn't even cost more. It costs like 10 to 100 times less than the comparable old school options. And it offers you all of this promise in an affordable, incredibly easy to use package. We've had people that have literally zero printing experience who go from, they've ordered their printer arrives, and that's where the timer starts. And by the time the timer stops at 1 week, They've got their printer put together, they've got the printer dialed in, and they've printed themselves a Glock frame or an AR-15 lower or a magazine for a Glock. And so like the learning curve is so shallow. And it does climb eventually as you print different materials and you print more complex shapes, and maybe if you get into designing stuff there's more skill curve there, but the initial skill curve is so shallow that any comparison to like using a mill and a lathe is just absurd.
So you go from needing workshop to needing a TV tray in the corner of your apartment.
Right. Like if you lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with someone, like if you had a roommate, as long as your roommate was never in your room, you could do this without them having any clue what you're doing in there. So like as long as they weren't able to look inside of your room, it doesn't make a lot of noise. So it doesn't sound, a 3D printer is less noisy than a mill, at least I should say. It's more clandestine in that regard. And it's not going to take up much space in a 2-bedroom apartment. Like it would take up 1 bedroom's worth of space.
So I'm really curious because like obviously you're presenting a good like economic standpoint of like why 3D printing is significant, but how do you make the case to the normies out there, the Joe Biden voters, the Trump voters, that 3D printed guns is kind of necessary? Like why is this important that we're able to manufacture guns without serial numbers? Because you have Trump supporters and Biden supporters alike saying that we need the serial numbers. We shouldn't be able to trade guns en masse with that are manufactured from homes and stuff like that. So why is this important? How can you make that cultural change that we're trying to make?
Well, I think the easy answer to that question, the one that immediately pops to my mind is I don't believe the government has any business knowing what you own. And the only way under the current regulatory scheme to make sure that the government doesn't know what guns you own in the broadest of senses requires you that you make them yourself. So of course people would bring up the fact that if you do a third party purchase, so like person to person transfer of a firearm, generally speaking you don't need a background check. But if the government comes and asks the guy who sold you the gun who he sold it to, do you believe he won't sell you out? I mean, if it's your uncle or your best friend, sure, maybe he'll just lie to the ATF and say like, "Oh, I sold it to this crackhead down by the river." Doesn't even matter, right?
The voting act.
Right. So like, it's tricky in that regard. Like, if you really do want to own a gun free of government oversight, generally you're left with the option of making one yourself. And I would argue and reject arguments to the contrary of the fact that the founders did intend for us to be manufacturing guns ourselves. Over half of the guns that the Revolutionary Army was dependent on was made by small 1, 2, 3, or 4-man operations in very decentralized blacksmiths across the colonies. So they were very familiar with this idea of make guns completely off the radar of the government that's trying to rule over you and stop you from doing this. They were very in tune with this idea. So it's definitely not a valid argument to say that it's outside of the scope of the Second Amendment to make your own gun, because that's not even close to the case. And I've argued before, and I will continue to argue, like, if the founders had Ender 3s, they would be cranking out guns on their Ender 3s. They would absolutely be overjoyed.
All day.
They would be overjoyed at the possibility of having Ender 3s in their gun-making arsenal. So I guess, to wrap back around to your original question of how do you sell people on the usefulness of this, the cultural impact is, I mean, look, so it's an irreversible act, right? So the fact that the files are out there and the documentation's out there, and the fact that, increasingly by every day now, the guns are out there. So we know that we've sold Creality thousands of printers, right? We've moved thousands of Ender 3s for them, and we don't have like a referral code, and it's not like some sort of paid promotion or whatever. It's not like we're paid by Creality to shill their printer, even though it's been suggested that we do, but it's not the case. We just recommend the printer because it's cheap and it's useful, and we standardized on it almost 2 years ago now, and we've had no reason to change from it. Like, there's thousands of these printers out there now that have specifically been spurred on by the fact that we've been selling printers, to the point where Naomi Wu, who's on Twitter, she's a like one of these tech maker people lives in China, but has contacts at Creality. Like Creality was aware of the fact that the 3D printed gun world was big on using their printers, and Creality was okay with it. So they weren't trying to distance themselves. Like, no, we're not okay with this. They were like, oh, okay, look, people are using our printers how they see fit. So it was cool to sort of see, like, we were selling so many printers, like Creality just became aware of the fact that printers were being sold with this sort of purpose. So like, right, there's obviously a cultural impact that's undeniable, and I would argue like irreversible. So it's in the very early days, like 2013, the rallying cry was something needs to be done about this before it's too late, before people are like printing guns casually in their own homes, before this becomes normalized, if you will. Because I'm sure people who don't want you doing this realize if this ever becomes any shade of normal, then advocacy organizations will try and defend it with lawsuits if you try and ban it. And it'll reach a point where it becomes such a commonplace and well understood practice that even if you ban it, it's not going to stop it. So that's like anybody who has any familiarity with like drug prohibitions knows, as soon as the use and the use and proliferation of them are commonplace, no ban is actually going to stop it. Yeah. It's like if weed was somehow made in a laboratory, and if the government stopped it before anyone knew about it, then it would never be made, right? It would be very difficult for it to be made. But unfortunately, it's not the way it works. I guess maybe a better example would be like meth or LSD. So if I think it was Swedish, the guy who invented LSD never let anyone know how to make it, no one would ever use it. The problem is, though, he let people know how to make it. Now that's never going to change. It's irreversible.
Because you can make something in your garage that's impossible to regulate. If you look at prohibition, you got guys just running out into the fucking woods up in Appalachia and making moonshine because you can't stop what a person can do with a trip to the hardware store and enough time and patience.
They can only stop you between point A and B. They can't stop you at A, and they can't stop you really at B.
Maybe I'm dating myself a little, but do you guys remember the early... I joked about the meth lab earlier, but there's another interesting parallel when Oklahoma, for instance, made it impossible to buy Sudafed unless you went and signed for it at the pharmacist. They just came up with other methods. They stopped the number, they cut down the number of labs, but then, other labs came from Mexico, and then they developed a whole nother, I think they called it the shake and bake. You needed a 2-liter plastic bottle of, and just different precursor chemicals.
A bottle of shit that'll probably all kill you on its own.
So, yeah.
So, before I hand it back over to Max and Jay here, so why exactly do you need an AK-47? Why do you need an AR-15? Why do you need extended mags?
Why does somebody need 2 houses? Why does somebody need to make more than X dollars a year? Why does somebody need more than 1 pair of shoes? And it's fundaments of liberty and living one's life the way they want to live one's life, and especially with things that can be used as functional objects. So I think there's probably a good parallel that can be drawn between shoes and guns. So you don't really need shoes. You could just stay in your house and walk around barefoot all the time, but maybe if you want to run, if running something you want to do, need to do to stay healthy, you'll need a pair of running shoes. Now let's say that maybe you also need employment to make money, and so you're going to do that at a job site. You're going to need something stronger than running shoes because your feet could easily get smashed, or you'll just wear your shoes out because you're walking on gravel all day. So maybe you need a pair of work boots. I'd argue in that same regard, maybe you need a particular firearm, something small, compact that you can carry on your person because you realize that it's not a safe world and you may need to defend yourself at some point in time. And maybe you need a long gun, much like you would need work boots for more serious use. So maybe you realize that given where you live, that you could have your house broken into by 1 or more people. And any sort of statistic or fact that could be gamed one way or the other be damned, you're going to make the decision for yourself to have something that you would use to defend your property and your life the way you see fit. And no one should ever have the level of control over you that they can tell you how best to defend yourself in your home with your own life, surrounded by the fruits of your own hard work. No one should ever have the level of control over you that they can say, well, you could defend yourself with this, but don't you think an AR-15 is a bit much? I reject any sort of arguments to that effect.
If they have ARs, then I'm gonna want to have one too.
See, that's how I know when people are an extremist, is because they tell people that I just kind of want to live my life and have people leave me alone. Like that's key. Like, how dare you want to not live exactly how I tell you to live?
Right?
The audacity of some people.
Don't you realize that these people know better than you? They live in a city close to a coast.
Exactly. That politician that's been in office for 40 years and never has a real job really knows how to handle a fucking crowd of 40 wild hogs going through your territory with your fucking 9 magazine, fucking 9mm fucking Glock. Like, fuck off. Get the fuck out of here.
I see people who live in LA or New York.
Have you fucking shot a hog with a 9mm? Are you fucking with me right now? Jesus.
These people, they say, "Oh, well, you can't hunt deer with an AK-47." I'm like, what the fuck are you on?
What?
I mean, granted, these people haven't been within
That's a great match.
They've probably never seen a gun outside of the hands of a cop because they live in California or New Jersey or New York.
If you can hunt a commie with it, you can hunt a fucking deer with it. That's the rule.
Paxton, I thought we said no NAP violations today.
I didn't say anything about helicopters. I didn't say anything about it.
So, Ivan,
I haven't even got to the wood chippers. I've been good. By the way, Ivan, do you think that you can 3D print a wood chipper?
I imagine you could 3D print some parts of a wood chipper.
Okay.
I feel
That's
like,
all I needed to know.
I feel like in the grand scheme of things, there'd probably be easier ways to make a wood chipper than to employ 3D printing. But
it's the principle is really what it is at this point.
So,
Yeah.
If somebody wants to get involved, besides obviously donating money to you or your comrades in the link that we have down below in the YouTubes, how can a person get involved in the Keybase, in development? What does a person have to do for you to accept a design?
So the Keybase team, which is called DET_DISP, so short for Deterrence Dispensed, is open. So anybody can join there and then post things. But if you end up like posting weird political things or shilling, I don't know, like weird Kickstarters, which is what we've had people doing recently, you're going to get banned because it's specifically a community aimed at the development of 3D printed guns. And I really don't care what your hot take on Kenosha Kyle is. I really don't. And you'll just be banned if you decide to share that with us. For whatever reason, we ever since Kenosha Kyle went and shot a bunch of people, we've just been them. So
I've had to stop going to the political channel.
They must be very wise.
Eventually,
like,
eventually we got kind of bored of those. But that channel is open to all sorts of discussion about 3D printed guns specifically. It's very nice whenever people are talking about like troubleshooting or fixing issues or improvement and like actual gun development. But even if the conversation is just about guns broadly, it's generally mostly just about people talking about guns, not even necessarily 3D printed all the time. Like if you have the gumption and you feel like you want to take up designing something, absolutely you can. Generally speaking, the way that works is if you've developed something on your own and you've done some basic amount of testing on it, so you've at least shown proof of concept, we can set you up with a beta team. And so the way that we do testing is we have a sub channel on the main Deterrence Dispensed team that's specifically for beta testing. So there's probably like 10 or more things in beta at this time. One of the more recent projects to get done with its beta is a 3D printable Tokarev TT33 frame. And I think that would work for both the 9mm and the 7.62 Tokarev guns. But the guy had developed that, and then he'd opened the beta for it. And I'm not sure how many people he had join him in beta testing it. So some beta tests, you can't get anybody to help you, and that's okay. So you just use the beta test as a room where you can post updates for people who are at least interested in the project if no one else managed to get a parts kit. But yeah, you go through your beta test. So the Mac Daddy is probably the most popular beta test right now, that 3D printable Mac 11 9mm frame. And it's got, it's got hundreds of people in it that have, printed them, and they give feedback on the design and any sort of tips or tricks or tweaks that can go along with the documentation or the CAD model or the files. And then once that beta wraps up, it eventually gets published publicly, so everyone can access the files like one click super easily. And so the purpose of the beta is just to make sure that multiple people across the multiple different printers and then multiple different kinds of filament types in a sort of closed group. So some of the betas are closed, so you have to be invite. Some of the betas are public, but regardless, they end up being more closed and having the files just like easily accessible out there public. So in the event there's an issue with the files or the documentation, it isn't like widespread. So that's generally the purpose for the beta testing teams. So if you are an individual who feels like developing something, or you have developed something and you've got it to that point that it's like at least proof of concept is shown, you can reach out to me or Control Pew on Keybase, and we'll set you up with a beta team so we can get you going on that. And generally speaking, there's a couple of like general purpose channels on the Deterrence Dispensed Keybase. So there's one where people talk about do-it-yourself ammunition, even though generally speaking, that channel is just plagued by people who like talk about do-it-yourself ammunition and talk about it and talk a lot about it and don't actually do anything for it. So
you're gonna say
there's like a whole lot of what I refer to as LARPing. So like there's a lot of people who want to feel like they're doing a lot of very cool stuff, but never actually take the gumption or initiative to actually go and do it. So there's a lot of that sometimes ends up going on, but even still, it's worth hanging out for a lot of people just to like have an ear to the ground as far as new and interesting things that are happening.
So do you have any benchmarks, anything that people have to, any requirements for the designs, like lasting a certain number of rounds or being of a certain quality? Do you have any sort of say in how that works at all? So
not really, because it would be very application specific. So generally speaking, so long as they themselves with their personal build have got it to fire somewhat reliably, so however much you would expect from it. If it was a gun that was primarily printed like Liberator style, if it could do 10 rounds maybe, that would be very cool. Through a printed barrel, that would be awesome. If it's something printed frame wise, at least 100. I would expect any well-designed printed frame to at least be able to go 100 rounds. That's something that should be, as long as it's at all a viable project worth pursuing on one's own personal build, they should be able to get it past 100 rounds. So okay, that's sort of like a rough benchmark in that regard.
I mean, we can't expect a Saturday night special to have the same level of reliability and durability as like an AR, but
right.
So, what do we have any questions on the two reviews?
So one of our commenters asked about the differences between the Plastikov 1.0 to the 2.0. Do you have any particular or major comments about that, like what the major differences are?
I guess because it's a podcast, I'll answer it. But if this person asked it directly to me, I'd tell them to read the fucking manual. I specifically detailed the changes. But so the Plastikov 1.0 was set up specifically to work only with AMD 65 rear trunnions and stocks. And the AMD 65 kits dried up right after the Plastikov was released, probably as a result of the Plastikov release. So a lot of people were then left with, you don't really have a canonical answer to that question. And by canonical, I mean like the source files for the Plastikov didn't have any sort of option that you could go to, because you can't really buy, at least it's not affordable to buy AMD 65 rear trunnions, on their own. So the first thing I wanted to change with the Plastikov V2 was I wanted to have those a generic rear trunnion. So it's not a rear trunnion that's specifically made for any particular AK. So I just wanted to base it off of like a normal rear pistol trunnion. And of course, those are already sold out. The one that I standardized on is now already sold out, which is wonderful. Hopefully they'll be back in stock soon. It's made by a U.S. manufacturer, so they are at least still in production. So hopefully those get back in stock. But that's probably the most significant change, was I changed to a pistol rear trunnion and then gave it an AR-15 buffer tube thread. So you could thread in any AR-15 buffer tube-based stock onto the rear end. And so that gives you like AR-15 carbine stocks, A2 M16 style stocks. So all sorts of options that you're then afforded by that. A little bit more modular in that regard. The next change, I changed, instead of like before, it was kind of like a kludge solution for the hammer and trigger pins. I just had you sort of wedge the hammer and trigger pins in there and then melt plastic in to keep them in place. It now uses an M5 bolt for both hammer and trigger pins. That was a suggestion by Brandon Herrera, the AK guy, on YouTube, as I'm sure most people are familiar with. So that was a suggestion from him.
Oh, that's fucking cool.
Not just any AK guy, the AK guy.
Right. That was a suggestion from him to change that, and that ended up being a wonderful suggestion. That's worked really well on my Plastikov version 2 build. I changed the rail specs slightly. It was an improvement from the original spec. So the new rails, the V2 rails, if you will, can work in the previous version receiver. There's no issue there. And the old rails can work in the new receiver. It just tweak some small specs by very small amounts, because we had 2 rail vendors step up and be interested in selling rails for the Plastikov. That's avesrails.com and riptiderails.com, who are selling hand fit and milled spec rails respectively. And the quick 101 on those is the hand fit rails are made out of tubing and require the person building the gun to do a little bit of bending and a little bit of trimming to make the rails fit perfectly. And as a result of them being made from tubing, they're much cheaper to manufacture, so they can be sold to you a little cheaper. Meanwhile, the milled spec rails are milled from a billet bar stock, and they drop in. So much like with a Polymer 80, you just drop the rails in the finished frame and it's good to go. You drop the milled spec rails in a finished Plastikov print, and then it's ready to fire like that. So it saves you that hand fitting if you're someone that tends to break things that you have to hand fit and you aren't very tactile when it comes to metal shaping. You can just get the milled spec, but they end up being more expensive in that regard. So that was probably another big change for the Plastikov V2.0, was it has the both spec rails, and both of those specs were developed with CNC technology. So both those manufacturers are using CNC tools. So their spec, their production of these rails was very repeatable. So we were able to dial in those specs so we know that they're good. Meanwhile, when I was developing those specs with my own little home mill and the home tubing I was making, I was doing all that by hand. So I didn't have any CNC machining going on. So even though I tried to stay very close to the spec, I was not consistently able to hit the spec spot on every time, because I'm not as precise as a computer controlled mill, if you will. So that was probably the most important change, was the fact that there's now rail vendors selling rails, and we know that the rail specs that they're running are good. And we've seen multiple people now build Plastikov. So before the release, I think there had been, or before the V2.0, or before the sale of commercial rails, I think there were 5 Plastikovs that were out there that that had at least been confirmed to me. And then I think now we're at double digits. So double digits since V2.0. So much more people getting involved in building this. And AKs aren't like ARs. They aren't super nice to build. They aren't super simple. Even the Plastikov, which sets out to be a little bit easier than building an AK the correct way, is still more difficult than building an AR. But it's interesting to see, there's been some people that have sort of picked up and built some AKs this way. So that's probably the biggest change. I guess I'm short selling the fact that for V2.0, I did a total documentation write-ups, like a step-by-step with pictures of how it is that you put everything together from, the receiver that you finished printing and taking supports off of, all the way up to, how it is that you do your pre-flight check. So how you check things on the gun before you actually go and shoot it to make sure everything's put together right. Documented all that, and then did it on video as well. So I did a video that goes from the very beginning of that process to the end. So that I'm sure that's ended up helping people too that were like apprehensive or confused by the original instructions, which didn't have pictures and were admittedly shorter and less precise than they could have been.
Okay, that was a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot of improvements that are being made. Here, I'll throw you an easy one. Of all of the things that you've made, Ivan, what are you most proud of?
Oh, geez.
We're going to say that this is going to be the last question, and then we're going to wrap it up and then end it for the night.
Okie dokie. So
Yeah,
most proud of. I feel like my project that I like the most is probably the printed high power frames, which aren't even in beta yet, but hopefully will be soon. Mostly because I believe the Browning high power is not only the best looking handgun ever designed, but the best handgun ever designed.
It's John's pistol.
and it's fine if you want to debate, because being wrong is your right. But as far as the project that I got probably the most enjoyment out of, it would have been like the very early days of the Plastikov, which is like a year ago to the day was when I got my first good Plastikov finally printed. Like when I fired the first round to the Plastikov, I was sure it was just going to shatter into a million pieces. And, of course, my hands would be blown off, because that's how it always works whenever something breaks. Is your hand is immediately severed off, and you're left with a stump where your wrist used to be. And like it was exciting, because it's sort of got this never done before, because no one had ever printed an AKM pattern receiver. And so it was exciting to try. And I think that project probably gave me the most, like I haven't had those sort of vibes since then. And I guess, I mean, at least for me, it's not good that I haven't had those vibes since, but I guess you don't always get to work on the cool, super exciting projects that are like extremely naysayed. So as soon as I announced I was going to do a printable AK receiver, had tons of people flood in from Twitter and Reddit to tell me like, oh, nope, it's not going to work. Here's a list of reasons why this will never work. And then I kept telling them like, okay, yeah, we'll see. And then, my responses on Reddit of like, oh, okay, yeah, we'll see, got downvoted because everybody was clicking the disagree button, because no, they would not see. They would refuse to see. But no, it turned out it ended up working really well. And so it eventually got around to the point like people were like, well, this is stupid. You can just make a receiver out of a washing machine. Because I guess washing machine panels in the U.S. are the same thickness as AK receivers. And so I would ask these people, like, have you made an AK receiver out of a washing machine? And they would say no, but it could be done. And immediately as soon as they admit that, like, I at least feel like I've won some psychological victory, because I don't know, I feel like that praxis is at least somewhat useful. Like if you can actually make the gun that you say that it's possible for you to make, then you've done something better than someone who says that they could make the gun, but they'll never actually make it.
Oh, shit, now I want a broken washing machine. I wonder where I can find one of those.
Junkyard, full of them. Or scrap yards.
So I think that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for coming on, Ivan.
Yeah, this was great. I really enjoyed this. I learned a bunch of shit.
I am looking forward to the day, Ivan, when we circle back in, say, 5 years, and we're talking about 3D printed and or garage built high velocity 20 millimeters.
Well, I guess we'll
see. Do I have something to tell you what I'm working on?
Raise the bar. We're gonna all talk about this.
So thank you very much.
Oh yeah, no, this was amazing. I really enjoyed this. I'm a little bit low energy tonight because I did not sleep yesterday, but this was
You didn't smoke enough weed, don't lie.
No, I tried not to smoke too much weed because I was so sleep deprived. This was amazing though. I fucking loved it. Thank you very much for agreeing to come on and talk to us and stuff.
Absolutely, it was fun.
So yeah, thank you guys very much for watching the show. If you have any other questions or anything like that, throw it down in the comments after the live stream here, and maybe we can poke Ivan about it. But if it's manual related, go read the fucking manual.
Yeah.
Otherwise, again, thank you guys very much for watching. Like and subscribe to the channel. Hit us up in the coin tree where you can see our various merchandise and things of that. Definitely check out Ivan's stuff. He's got the donation links and stuff like that we're providing below. So definitely help him out. He's a saint.
Yeah. These people
for
are
the
doing
Second
God's
Amendment.
work. You help them.
He's at least doing the Boogs work. Anyway, yeah, check out the coin tree merchandise. Check out the subscribe star. The lowest denomination is $5 a month. Every single dollar goes directly back into the show. Mike and I are doing all this directly out of pocket, so every little dollar goes a very long way. As you can see, Mike is a homeless person.
I am not. God damn it.
You look like a Fallout New Vegas character. I don't know what you're on about right now. You look like
I'm not a homeless person.
You're out of like
God
New Vegas over here.
And
Looking
the
for
show,
your
what
fucking
is
fresh
out of our
water.
misery?
You got some rad roach in the back, my guy. Anyway, yeah. So check us out on Subscribestar. Hit that $5. We're very, very fortunate that we got someone the other day to donate like $15, and Mike and I were freaking out. We're like, oh man, we can finally afford chicken McNuggets. Yeah, there's all of our subscribers, and if you would like to join that list, all you have to do is join the Subscribestar. Helps us out a lot. We will be back again tomorrow morning, 6:30 a.m. And and then of course Monday we will have our next live stream as well.
Yeah.
Then finally, if you're not able to provide any financial assistance directly, you can check out the Brave link. We get a little bit of monies just for you signing up, and then we get a little bit more monies if you stay for a month. Brave is really cool because you basically get free premium YouTube and Hulu out of it because it blocks all the ads without fucking up any of the broadcasting. So that's really nice. And then lastly, you can join the Discord and Element/Riot, and volunteer some of your time to help us out doing research and getting new guests and all that good stuff.
You left out one of the up and coming episodes. We have on V-Day, we're going to have the Goon Squad podcast, some of the people from
That's still new.
Yeah,
what is that? What day?
It's on November 5th. It's Thursday.
November 5th. Okay. November 5th, Thursday, we've got the Goon Squad coming on. So definitely be sure to check us out then at 7:30 p.m. Central Time. Otherwise, you can check us out every single morning, 6:30 p.m. or 6:30 a.m. Central Time for the Mad Coffee Break. Thank you guys very much for watching. We will see you guys tomorrow morning.
Yes. Until then, be safe and be free. This Mad LiberTEA time is adjourned.